Let me tell you about a problem so grave that it unites people. It unites especially the rich people, because here is that problem. Everything is so super expensive that we don't know where to put our money. The S&P 500 is close to all-time highs. Property prices are close to all-time highs. Gold is close to all-time highs. Heck, even Bitcoin is close to its all-time high. And at the same time, consumer goods aren't getting cheaper. Inflation rates are still somewhat elevated. So we can't buy anything. Everything is super expensive. We can't keep it in cash either, because the cash devalues over time. What should we do? We are in a special situation here. Interest rates are very high. We've got real positive rates, at least according to official inflation rates. So it does cost real purchasing power to borrow money. So what will happen once the Fed pivots? Once interest rates come down, who will benefit? Have a look at the S&P 500 over time. Interest rates went up, the S&P 500 went up as well. Interest rates went down, the S&P 500 went down at the same time. Interest rates stayed low, pretty much at zero for a while. The S&P 500 gained. Interest rates rose again. The S&P 500 didn't stop rising. A falling of interest rates, an increase of interest rates. There doesn't seem to be that much of a connection between interest rates and stock market returns. There are short-term effects on the days of the announcements, but there isn't anything lasting apparently. At least it's not the dominant force driving prices. But have a look at this. We still have our interest rates at the top, but this time at the bottom, we've got something else. We've got the price of long-term government bonds. When interest rates go up, bonds aren't doing too great. When interest rates go down, bonds can rally quite a bit. When interest rates suddenly speak up, then long-term bonds crash. And there is a fundamental reason for this, right? US bonds are nothing else than a promise by the US government to pay you back fiat money. So when you're buying US bonds, the government will pay you fiat at some point in time. And when interest rates are currently very elevated, you have to discount those future cash flows by quite a bit. When interest rates go down, you discount them less. The sum of all the future cash flows is the value of the bond. So declining interest rates is good for bond prices. Thus, if the Federal Reserve pivots at some point, or when people anticipate that pivot, then long-term government bonds will benefit from this the most. Now, there is an anticipation effect here, right? The bond prices already went down while US interest rates were still low. That went on for roughly 1.5 years before we saw the actual turnaround. Thus, I believe, because prices are still relatively low, that the market isn't yet anticipating declining interest rates. We might see those interest rates for a while, maybe even until something implodes. Because, of course, very elevated interest rates do put pressure on pretty much any company, especially the highly levered one. Now, I strongly believe in asset diversification, not necessarily only to reduce the volatility of your portfolio to be safe. I believe in this mainly to shift around portfolio weightings as there are waves across different asset classes. You want to own assets that do not have a high correlation. As in, you don't just want to own stock A and B and C. You want to instead own different classes. You want to own gold, you want to own property, you want to own stocks, you want to own bonds. And then when something goes down a lot, you can buy that at those depressed prices with the other thing that's potentially very high. So currently, according to that logic, it makes sense to buy long-term government bonds. And then in case they recover, or once they recover rather, then you're checking what asset class might be depressed at that point and then buy that. This only works if there is little correlation, as in if the two assets don't move in the same direction at the same time. Luckily enough though, for bonds and stocks, that is the case. Have a look at the monthly returns of the S&P 500 in green and a long-term government bond ETF here in turquoise. And have a look at the thing at the bottom. This is the correlation coefficient. It couldn't be more random than this. It's pretty much zero correlation. Sometimes the two assets move in the same direction. Sometimes they move in opposite directions. There seems to be pretty much zero connection at all. Of course, negative correlation would be the best, because then we always know when one asset is high, the other is low, and we can always shift around. But zero correlation is pretty good as well. When you compare two assets in the same asset class, we don't see that. When we compare, say, stock A with stock B, we do see very high correlation. When we compare Bitcoin with Ethereum, we also see very high correlation. Here, this is the correlation coefficient of Bitcoin relative to Ethereum, pretty close to 1 most of the time. Here's the correlation between Apple and Microsoft, also above 0 most of the time. And let's debunk a myth here. Let's look at the correlation between Bitcoin and technology stocks, the Nasdaq 100. It's not as high as people make it out to be. We are crossing asset classes here. We are crossing crypto versus technology stocks. Sometimes the two assets move in the same direction at the same time. Sometimes they don't. So there is still diversification benefit. It doesn't make sense to own both. And it doesn't make sense to sell the thing that's high to buy the other thing that's low. Of course, if you believe that both assets over the long term tend to appreciate. So interest rates have the most impact on long-term government bonds. They don't have that much of an impact on stocks or on Bitcoin. I don't think it makes sense to overinterpret them. When interest rates are high, it makes sense to buy long-term government bonds. When interest rates are low, it makes sense to buy most of the other assets. I personally bought quite a lot of long-term government bonds recently, and I plan to hold this maybe for 2 or 3 years. I'm waiting for the recovery. I'm waiting for at least the anticipation of interest rates to come down. And declining interest rates are probably triggered due to an external event, right? If the economy is doing not so well. That then in turn, of course, depresses stock prices. So my bonds go up, stocks go down. That's when I then rebalance the portfolio again. If it's your first time here, feel free to subscribe. I publish videos regularly. A like would be very much appreciated as well. It helps the channel grow. Let's have a chat in Telegram together. Feel free to join the channel. Link is down below.